this will be your final voice recording about the migration series. And we ended in panel number 25 yesterday, and we're going to jump to panel number 49, which is in your PowerPoint number 35. So 49, which is where you have that golden barrier dividing people on the left and people on the right. I should have included in this PowerPoint presentation, now that I'm thinking about it more, panel number 19. So if you can go and Google Jacob Lawrence Migration Series panel 19, you will see in that panel, it's an earlier panel obviously, that shows also a very separated world for blacks and whites as they drink from different water fountain. And it's arranged, whereas this one is, the line is separating the people on a vertical line. The panel number 19, they're separated on a horizontal line. So in panel number 19, if you can bring that up and look at it, that was in the South. The migrants were still in the South, and there was a certain expectation in the South with all the different Jim Crow laws. In fact, by the 1920s, there were approximately 350 laws passed in southern states that legally segregated the races. And you know this history from your history classes, but everything from schools to cafes to theaters to cemeteries to water fountains, of course. Anything that we think of as a public place today was segregated. So if you look at panel 19, that was in the South. And so, of course, there was already this expectation in that social pressure and legal pressure to separate the races. Here we are when we fast forward to panel number 49, where the caption says they also found discrimination in the North, although it was much different. We still have that segregation. Now, there is no legal underlying reason for the races to be segregated in the North, but that social code, that pressure from other cultural sources was just as strong in the North as it was in the South. But as Lawrence writes in this caption, with his wife, of course, as they write here, the discrimination was different. And look how Lawrence depicts this discrimination. It's yellow, but we can imagine that little fence or that little gate or barrier, whatever it happens to be, being gold. Is Lawrence making some kind of subtle dig at how this northern promised land, this final destination of so many millions of people, how in the North it's kind of fancied up the discrimination. It's disguised, it's gilded, it's kind of veiled behind this golden barrier where everything is supposed to be so nice and perfect in the North, but it is in many ways just as insidious as it was in the South. Lawrence even said, of course, he frequented lots of the art museums in New York City, and he said once, you could go into the museums, but you didn't feel that you were welcome. So to continue with this idea of the social isolation that continues even once people arrived here in the northern part of the United States. And in the next slide, which is panel number 53, one of the most famous panels of the series, that incredibly opulent dress that woman is wearing with that big feather sticking out of her hat, that golden cane that the man in the top hat was wearing. Lawrence also remembers this great deal of elitism and this snobbery that existed amongst many of the African Americans who had become quite wealthy, who had already lived in New York and other northern cities, who had become beneficiaries of a roaring 20s economy. In the 1920s, when the economy and the stock market was doing well for so many people, a small minority, right, a very small minority of African Americans that already lived in these northern cities gained a certain prosperity. And so there's lots of historical documentation about how these families, these wealthy African American families, saw these waves of southern migrants, the people coming in multitudes from the South, saw them as in a sense, a way of undermining their hard-gained social prestige that they had worked so hard to achieve and to acquire. But this isn't exclusively the case. There are also many, many documented historical examples of the wealthier African American populations who assisted in different social organizations and in placing African Americans who had recently arrived from the South in jobs, finding locations for both housing and employment for them. So it's not as simplistic, of course, as this shows. But there was that sense of isolation, even from who you would have maybe thought or expected to be the people that would have been most welcoming when the migrants arrived from the South. So that concludes the last 6 panels concludes this part of the lesson about scenes of isolation. And as a final part to the Jacob Lawrence series, I just want to look at the next 3 panels, which are number 7, number 31, and number 46, I believe it is. 48. So 7, 31, and 48, which take on this language of abstraction, this very modernist approach to the telling of this historical event, which is the Great Migration. And I want to remind you of that painter that we studied earlier in the year, Courbet. And remember what Courbet writes in his statement on realism. He writes that the history painter must be of his or her own era. It's impossible for the painter to paint any other period, any other histories but their own. And Lawrence, of course, when he's painting this is 1940, 1941, the language of art in the 1940s is primarily a language of abstraction. This is the major recurring, popularized artistic form that is coming both out of Europe and emerging in the United States. So he is, as he's aware of the artistic trends both historically and in the contemporary world, he is using some of these abstractions to every once in a while in some of his panels to incorporate them. So here in this scene, number 7, panel number 7, which is a scene of, once again, the agriculture of the southern part of the United States, it's giving it a completely different perspective. These rows of cultivated fields are seen. It's been written that flow, that upward flow that it's created by looking at this, pulls you along with as a viewer in the same way that if you were a worker in the fields just push you along, move you along as you pluck, as you harvest, as if you yourself were the worker in this field. Also, remember from an earlier audio I had mentioned the New Deal program, the FSA, the Farm Security Administration, who the federal government paid many photographers, many artists to go and document the conditions of the people in the fields. Lawrence, of course, is looking at a lot of these photographs and taking from them inspiration for his creation of scenes of rural rural Southern America and urban centers in the northern part of the United States, which leads us to our next panel, number 31, which is very kind of Mondrian-esque. And an interesting fact, if you don't remember this, but Mondrian moves to New York City. He was living in London during World War II, or in beginnings of World War II, he moves out of Paris to London. And then in 1940, Mondrian moves to New York City. So the year that Jacob Lawrence is creating this series is the year that Mondrian moves to New York City. So they're living in the exact same space. And first of all, remember, kind of compare this with those scenes of the South, those agricultural, wide open spaces, blue skies. And here, the sky, the landscape is completely different. Everything has been obstructed. Those skyscrapers, those high-rises, those apartment buildings in the north give you a completely different visual experience. Remember, George O'Keeffe is painting in New York City in the 1920s. 1920s, she's painting those skyscrapers from the top floors. So Jacob Lawrence is doing, in many ways, the same thing that she's doing, of giving this completely new visual code and painting them these scenes as he himself would have seen the city. But this is a very abstracted way of looking. Remember that video that you watched on Ellsworth Kelly? That obsession with line, the obsession with color, the obsession with palette, the obsession with kind of paring down everything to its basic geometric components. This is exactly what Jacob Lawrence is doing in this scene. And as the final scene in this lesson, this is panel number 48, and we've entered into the room of a shared residence. Once again, not only do we have this kind of strange perspective artistically, but we have a brand new physical space that many people are encountering as they move into these urban centers. It's known historically, statistically, that in the 1930s, African Americans in Harlem were paying 40% of their wages on rent, as opposed to white New Yorkers were spending about 20%, sometimes even less than 20% of their average wages on rent. So you can see the levels of exploitation that continue to this will be your final Detroit of giving this completely new visual, spending about 20%, sometimes even less than 20% of their average wages on rent. So you can see the levels of exploitation that continue to happen to the African American population even as they move into the northern centers. And oftentimes these apartments that were not only in Harlem but also the south side of Chicago, different areas of Philadelphia, of Cleveland, of Pittsburgh, all these kind of in Detroit, these industrialized northern cities. A lot of times these apartments were cut up into smaller sections, and oftentimes they had communal spaces, communal kitchens, communal bathrooms, but the level of the rent didn't change. So as the spaces were carved up into smaller spaces for people to move into, the rent stayed the same. So there's that level of kind of the history behind this. And then there's the artistic history that Lawrence is drawing from as he's looking at these new spaces, and under the influence not only of abstraction, this new painterly way of depicting the world, but also photography. Remember, we talk about photography and the way that you can have those kind of truncated edges. We see that in this panel very clearly, and in the previous panel, the lack of the central focus, those unique angles that are captured within the parameters of the frame itself. So Lawrence is using all of these new, revolutionary, abstracted cues to incorporate into his work. So that concludes your lesson on Jacob Lawrence, the Migration series. Lawrence went on to have a pretty remarkable artistic career. This is his most famous series from an art historical perspective. Because of the sheer relevancy of the images, but also, he's the first African American painter exhibited at MoMA. Then he moves to Washington State eventually and has a long and successful teaching career in a university there. But remember, Lawrence is one of these, he's awarded this fame, he's awarded this pedestal status because he's one of those very few artists that find themselves in the right historical moment with the right tools in the right place at the right time, that he can capture a moment so perfectly that it embodies in this case, it embodies the spirit of the day, the spirit of that collective history of having migrated to, in Lawrence's case, to Harlem, but also has this eternal appeal. So it not only connects to the historical moment in which it was created, but think about how, now in 2020, looking at this 70 years later, is my math correct? 1940, 1920, 70 so years later, we find ourselves, right, in this moment of isolation. Is it feasible to think that our eyes and our own experiences are adding another level of nuance and understanding and appreciation to these works of Lawrence's series for us in the contemporary scene? So all of these factors are what make Lawrence the artist that receives such a privileged status today, in that we study him in an art history course.